We all know at this point that marijuana laws have perpetuated long-running racial disparities in the criminal justice system. According to the ACLU, for instance, a black person is 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person, even though black and white people use marijuana at similar rates. So over the past few years, lawmakers in states that have legalized recreational weed, including New York, Massachusetts, Illinois, California, and elsewhere, have tried to find ways of making sure that the very people who have been the victims of draconian drug laws are now in a position to benefit from the legal weed boom. Enter cannabis social equity, which includes initiatives like states investing tax revenue from weed sales into communities of color, or, more commonly, prioritizing people from disadvantaged backgrounds and/or with prior marijuana convictions for licenses and loans when it comes to opening dispensaries. I think there are probably genuinely good intentions behind this ongoing interest in correcting the missteps of the war on drugs through these new so-called equity programs. But here's why the rise of cannabis social equity has been nothing short of a neoliberal nightmare. Today, more than 2/3 of Americans want to legalize marijuana, including 83% of Democrats, 71% of independents, and 50% of Republicans. As recreational weed becomes legal in more and more states, lawmakers in those places are also now trying to make sure black and brown people who were disproportionately likely to be targeted during the war on drugs have sufficient representation in the growing legal cannabis industry. So this may sound noble, but cannabis equity programs have been a flop in almost every single state that has tried them. Here's how the business publication Cranes summarized the situation a few years ago. Quote, "From California to Colorado to Massachusetts, cannabis rollout programs have been fraught with controversy and criticism. In nearly every state and locale, activists and budding cannabis entrepreneurs complain that, despite altruistic intentions, the social equity ambitions of legalization have gone awry, and the business remains mostly in the hands of wealthier white businessmen." To look at some examples, back in 2020, Illinois announced it would designate a certain number of dispensary and growing licenses to what lawmakers called social equity applicants. Here's how that went.
By May 1st, the state will award 75 new recreational use dispensary licenses to diversify an industry that is mostly owned by white men. Social equity applicants get priority.
There are points built into the application for who is a social equity applicant, what communities you come from, how have you been touched by this over the course of your life.
Including more points for applicants who have marijuana arrests in their past. Barbershop owner Danny Joe Sorge is one of them, but he and so many others face a daunting task of getting through the application process.
The application itself is very lengthy. It's a 400-page application, and you have to have certain resources and infrastructure in place just to navigate the completion of it.
This application is harder than my grad school application.
2 years later, Illinois' cannabis social equity program is still struggling to actually award licenses to disadvantaged applicants. As the Chicago Tribune recently found, the complicated and costly application scoring process ended up last year with just 21 of 937 social equity applicants qualifying for the initial lottery to get one of the 75 licenses for the retail outlets known as dispensaries. Furthermore, as a result of the program's extreme and ongoing inefficiency, the state is also now caught up in several costly lawsuits. To date, literally 0 new businesses have come out of the social equity program. A very similar scenario is currently playing out in Arizona, which tried to institute its own cannabis social equity program by earmarking a whopping total of 26 social equity dispensary licenses for low-income people with prior weed convictions. Unfortunately, as an expose by the Phoenix New Times found, it turns out the majority of applications for these social equity licenses came from investors or people connected to established cannabis companies already operating in multiple states. So, as you can imagine, that whole program is also now tied up in a lawsuit. Meanwhile, other states appear to have learned very little from these bureaucratic failures. New York, which will begin rolling out recreational dispensaries by the end of the year, appears to be going down a similar path. In March, New York announced that it would grant its first 100 dispensary licenses to people with past marijuana convictions as part of a cannabis equity initiative. However, The catch is that the state is also requiring that, in addition to having a past weed conviction, applicants must submit financial statements and other paperwork showing that they're already operating a legal and profitable business in the state, which, to say the least, really narrows down the pool of who's eligible. As journalist Ben Gilbert put it, to get a cannabis sales license in New York, you need to have a prior conviction and also 2 years of ownership of a profitable legal business. You essentially need to fit into a Venn diagram of nobody. Worse still is that the complicated guidelines and Byzantine application processes are really only the beginning. As a recent investigative piece in the New Republic found, even when people do manage to get a hold of coveted social equity licenses, they frequently find themselves without the resources to actually get their cannabis businesses off the ground. Bank loans are not an option, as most banks refuse to do business with an industry-breaking federal law, author Amanda Lewis wrote. As a result, cannabis business owners often end up forced to turn to specialized cannabis investors that very often engage in predatory practices. According to Lewis, cannabis companies that incubate social equity applicants might provide loans at 12 to 17% interest rates when the US average is 3 to 7%. They might require the equity applicant to stock the incubating company's product, purchased at locked-in rates above market value, or stipulate that the social equity applicant's business can only ever be sold to the bigger company for a predetermined amount. More cynical financiers might simply offer the equity applicant a $35,000 salary in exchange for total control over the business. So, judging by the record to date, cannabis social equity, as a program supposedly meant to benefit the very communities hit hardest by the war on drugs, has failed miserably on its own terms. There's also another issue at stake. The problem with cannabis equity is not simply that these programs aren't reaching enough Black and brown people, or that they're mired in red tape, or that they open the door to predatory loan schemes, although all of those things are undoubtedly true. The more fundamental problem is that the entire notion of cannabis equity currently rests on the assumption that we can achieve some kind of social justice through the market and by simply encouraging entrepreneurship. But the truth is that even if the cannabis equity application process in every state worked perfectly and 100% of social equity licenses went to social equity applicants rather than to affluent business owners or brokers for big weed, that would still represent only a few hundred people nationwide who get a shot at participating in weed capitalism, which, by the way, doesn't even come with the guarantee of financial success. Meanwhile, keep in mind that between 2001 and 2010, there were over 8 million marijuana arrests in the US, the vast majority for possession. And ironically, several states that have legalized the sale of recreational marijuana still make it incredibly difficult for residents to expunge their past marijuana convictions. To further put into perspective how limited the returns on cannabis equity are, let's consider a path not taken: state-owned and state-run weed dispensaries. Yes, we all know Americans shudder at the thought of state control, particularly over our consumer products. But when you consider that private sector weed sales have already topped over $12 billion in the state of Colorado since 2014, there's an argument that state-run dispensaries would actually generate a huge infusion of revenue that could go to funding public goods like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Yes, states already collect taxes on weed sales, but what if even more of that money was public? These funds could even potentially provide financial compensation for people who have served time for marijuana offenses or whose past convictions have made it difficult for them to find jobs or housing. By contrast, the private sector cannabis industry is really only set up to enrich just a few lucky business owners. There's also at least one successful precedent for the state-run model. In Pennsylvania, the state currently owns and runs all liquor stores. This not only generates hundreds of millions of dollars in net income for Pennsylvania each year, but also creates thousands of union jobs. Shout out, by the way, to UFCW Local 1776. There's even some evidence that, contrary to myths about the wonders of free market competition, state-run liquor stores actually help keep liquor prices down. So if you ask me, there's no reason why state-operated weed dispensaries couldn't theoretically work in the same way. Instead of messing around with miserable, half-baked equity plans to try to make weed businesses a little more diverse, why not just take the private sector out of the equation completely and create an industry where sales and profits actually go to the public good? The Chicago Tribune once described cannabis social equity as a program, quote, designed to give a boost to individuals and communities that need an infusion of free market enterprise the most. But I think that's exactly backwards. The spectacular failure of cannabis equity shows why tinkering with the market and trying to make it just a little bit friendlier and a little more diverse, rather than confronting the zero-sum logic of the market head-on, will always be a losing game. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.